Ridgway. If you don't know me, if this is the first video you've seen on mine, then I'm the founder of the Anne Boleyn Files website, founder of the Tudor Society, and also author of several history books, including this pile here. I wrote this one, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown, and yes, various others. Now this is the first video in a series that I'm going to be doing on Anne Boleyn, answering questions that I received on the Anne Boleyn Files website. I actually asked people what questions they had about Anne Boleyn that they'd like answering. And today's today's presentation is really an opinion piece. And you may have a very different view to me on this question, or you may completely agree with me. But either way, I'd love to hear your take on it. So please, please, please leave comments below this video, just sharing your opinion too, because I'd love to know. There's no right answer to this one. So the question today is, did King Henry VIII love Anne Boleyn? Now, it's a question that is impossible for me or any author, historian, anyone to answer. In fact, only Henry VIII himself would be able to answer it. Unfortunately, I can't go back in time and ask him. But it's a question that often pops up. It's a question that I often get asked. And so it's one I want to explore today. And I thought it was the perfect question to get us started, because I feel it's a question that we can really explore and you can comment and share your views on. Now, let's set some context. Now, Anne Boleyn was recalled from serving Queen Claude, who was the wife of King Francis I of France, in late 1521. Now, it appears that Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, had recalled her from France due to marriage negotiations regarding a potential marriage match with James Butler, who was related to Anne. The Butlers were Thomas Boleyn's mother's family. The idea was that this marriage would settle a dispute between James's father, Sir Piers Butler, and Anne's father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, over a title. This was the title of the Earl of Ormond, and there was a dispute over this title following the death of Thomas's grandfather, Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond. Now, on her arrival in England, we don't know whether Anne arrived in late 1521 or whether it was early 1522. Her arrival's not recorded. She comes up in the records in Shrovetide, March 1522, when she took part in the Chateau Vert pageant. But on her arrival in England, Anne began serving Queen Catherine of Aragon, who was Henry I's first wife, and she began serving her as maid of honour. Now, sometime not long after her debut at the English court, now we don't have dates for this because at this point Anne Boleyn is not very important. At some point after her arrival back at the English court, Anne became romantically involved with a certain Henry Percy, who was son and heir of the 5th Earl of Northumberland. Now, we know some of this story from a biography written of Cardinal Wolsey by Wolsey's gentleman usher George Cavendish. So he was serving Cardinal Wolsey. He was sort of there at the English court. And in his biography, he writes that when the cardinal spent time at court, Percy would then resort for his pastime unto the Queen's chamber, and there would fall in dalliance among the Queen's ladies, being at the last more conversant with Mistress Anne Boleyn than with any other. It was then that there grew such a secret love between them that at length they were insured together, intending to marry. So they were courting each other and they fell in love and they were going to get married. But according to George Cavendish in this biography of Wolsey, the king found out about the romance and was much offended, that's how it's described, because of his own secret affection, his own feelings for Anne Boleyn. And he ordered Cardinal Wolsey, his right-hand man at the time, to put a stop to this relationship. Wolsey and Percy's father, the Earl of Northumberland, berated Percy, and a marriage match with Mary Talbot, who was a daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, was arranged for him instead. And actually Anne was sent back to her family home of Hever Castle, so she was kind of banished from the court for a bit to kind of calm down and forget Percy, and Percy was quickly married off to Mary Talbot. Now, although Cavendish says that the king found out about the romance and put a stop to it because of his own secret affection, Cavendish was actually writing this biography with the hindsight that Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII were going to fall in love and that the king would eventually marry Anne. So had the king fallen in love with Anne at this point? Well, we don't know. What is more likely at this point is that the negotiations for Anne to marry James Butler to settle the dispute of the earldom were still ongoing. And actually the king was heavily involved in these negotiations. He was helping with them. And also that Percy's father had arranged a marriage match with Mary Talbot. And so the couple's romance was a risk to all of these negotiations. The couple's folly, as it was called, threatened these marriage plans. It is impossible to date the start of Henry VIII's interest in Anne Boleyn, whether she caught his eye as soon as she got to court in late 1521, early 1522, or whether it was later. Historian Dr. David Starkey believes that Anne first caught the king's eye in the winter of 1524-1525, as that fits in with Cavendish's account of Wolsey's fall. So he dates it based on Cavendish's biography and the events of Wolsey's fall. Eric Ives, Anne Boleyn's biographer, however, has a different view. He dates the start of their courtship to Shrovetide 1526, so spring 1526, when the king rode out to the Shrovetide joust with the motto "Declare je n'ose," declare I dare not, embroidered on his costume, along with an image of a man's heart engulfed in flames. It may, however, simply have been one of those chivalric kind of themes. These Shrovetide pageants and jousts always had a theme such as, unrequited love, or, love in some way, a chivalric tradition. So it may not have been anything to do with Anne. It may not have had anything to do with the king's love life. It was just the theme that had been chosen for that Shrovetide's entertainment. It is hard to say whether it meant anything at all. But whatever the truth of the matter, whether they fell in love 1524, 1525, 1526, or rather the king sort of fell for her, whatever the truth of that, in August 1527, Henry VIII applied to the Pope for a dispensation to cover the impediment of affinity in the first degree. Now, impediment of affinity in the first degree meant that Henry wanted to marry someone who was closely related, i.e. mother or sister, of a woman he'd already been sexually involved with. So that surely has to be Anne Boleyn, because we know that the king had been involved with Mary Boleyn. So that fits with him having fallen in love with Anne by this point and wanting to marry her. So sometime before he applied for this dispensation, sometime before August 1527, Henry VIII had proposed to Anne Boleyn. And she had accepted his proposal in a very romantic way, in a very symbolic way, by sending him a costly diamond and the ship in which the solitary damsel is tossed about. And that Henry describes in a love letter to Anne Boleyn. And he took that as her humble submission, i.e. her yes to him saying, "Will you marry me?" Now, David Starkey believes that this jewelled trinket was sent by Anne to the king as a New Year's gift. This was a tradition at court. Gifts weren't exchanged at Christmas then. There was the Roman tradition of gift giving at New Year, and the king would receive gifts from favoured courtiers. He would give them gifts in return. And Starkey believes that Anne gave him this jewelled trinket as a New Year's gift in January 1527, because in Henry's love letter about this trinket that he's received from her, it's in French. He describes it as an étrennes, a gift usually given at New Year, not just the word cadeau, which, sorry, my French pronunciation is pretty bad. Not just a cadeau, which is a present, but this special word, this different word, which seems to have been reserved for New Year's gifts. So an acceptance of the king's marriage proposal in January 1527 does fit in nicely with Henry then applying to the Pope for a dispensation in August 1527. So it seems like a very valid theory. But what do we know of their courtship, and what led to this point? Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid very little. Even though we have love letters from Henry VIII to Anne, we don't have her replies to him. It makes a wonderful blank canvas for novelists. So we know very little. There is not one iota of evidence, and I want to say this very strongly, there is no evidence at all for the idea that Anne's father and her uncle acted as, well, I guess the only word you can describe it as is pimps for Anne and Mary Boleyn, and that they pushed the girls at the king so that they could rise in favour at court. No evidence for that at all. Makes great fiction, but it's not factual. There's also no evidence that Anne Boleyn was the kind of woman that set out to seduce and manipulate the king, that she had her eyes on the crown and she was going to throw herself at the king because she wanted to be queen. There's no evidence for that, and it doesn't make sense at all. Henry, how could Anne think that by throwing herself at the king she could ever be queen? Catherine of Aragon was queen. How could she ever think that the king was going to leave his wife of 20 odd years? It doesn't make sense. There was no kind of precedent for that, so that doesn't make sense. But what we do know from the king's love letters to Anne Boleyn, which are now housed in the Vatican archives and are unfortunately undated. I mean, please, Henry, why didn't you put dates on them? What we do know is that the king pursued Anne. He bombarded her with these love letters and gifts, things like sending her a deer that he had caught, which I suppose was a good gift in those days. I'm not sure that I'd be that impressed today. We know that on being bombarded with letters and gifts, that Anne retreated from court to her family home of Hever Castle in Kent, and to get away from it all. It was a very difficult position for her, being maid of honour to the king's wife and receiving love letters. We then know that Henry offered her the opportunity to be his official mistress, which would have been a position of power. She would have not just been a mistress who was a secret mistress, she would have been his official mistress, like King Francis I had official mistresses. We know that she refused that, wanting to hang on to her maidenhead and keep it for her husband, and that the king eventually proposed marriage and that Anne submitted and accepted his proposal. Now, Henry's feelings for Anne, was it love? Did he love her, or was this all just lust? Again, I can't answer that. It's impossible to say. I can only give you my opinion. But in June 1528, there was an outbreak of the sweating sickness illness. This was something that could kill people in hours. We've got contemporary reports where people felt okay at breakfast, apparently, but by dinner were dead. We have reports, which are slightly exaggerated, I think, of people just falling down dead in the street while they were walking. It was that bad an illness, and many of Henry's courtiers became ill with it, and some died of it. Anne became ill with it. She was at Hever Castle. She came down with sweating sickness. The king heard news that his sweetheart had been taken ill with this awful disease. He and Catherine of Aragon had removed from court to get away from the disease, and he'd taken sort of his physicians with him. And he wrote her a very, very panicked letter. You'll be able to find the text of it. It's amusing in a way, because he talks about sending her his second best doctor. Yeah. Is that all she meant to you, that you sent her your second best doctor? But that was good. You know, obviously he needed his best doctor in case he came down with it. So he was sending her the next best thing. Now, my dear friend, author Sandra Vasoli, has been to the Vatican archives, and she has held and looked at Henry VIII's love letters to Anne, which must have been an amazing experience. I've got a book of photos of them, which is lovely enough, but to actually hold them would be wonderful. And she noticed a marked contrast between this letter, this panic letter written after Henry's received news of Anne's illness, and the others that are in the collection. Sandra describes it as visually a mess, and I completely agree with her looking at the photos of it. The ink is smeared. There are sprays of ink where the nib of the quill has actually caught on the parchment as the king's been hurriedly writing this letter. There are ink blots, crossings out. It is a complete mess from a king that was usually very neat. The other love letters don't have this mess. It was a hurried letter written by a panicked man. I believe that its appearance is evidence of Henry VIII's pure terror on receiving news that the woman that he loves has gone down ill with an illness that could kill her. And I believe that surely points to it being more than lust, that it points to Henry loving Anne. Now, Henry also waited over 6 years for Anne Boleyn. Depends on when you date the start of their courtship. But at least 6 years for her. He went through all the stress of the great matter, his quest for the annulment. He made enemies of the Pope and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who of course was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He risked excommunication from a church that he had defended in the past. You know, he'd been given the title of Defender of the Faith. And he finally broke with Rome, who, you know, had been his beloved Rome. All of this to be with Anne Boleyn. That strikes me as a bit much for lust. I just can't see that. Henry could have taken mistresses to satisfy his lust. He didn't need to go through all of this. Now, you could argue, well, Claire, this is all because Henry was intent on having a son. You know, Catherine of Aragon, by this point, couldn't have any more children. She was not fertile anymore. And he'd only got an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, he didn't have a son and heir to secure the succession. But I'm sure that he could have legitimised Henry Fitzroy with the Pope's blessing. There were easier ways of going about getting a son and heir. I think he could have legitimised Henry Fitzroy, who he had raised to be Duke of Richmond and Somerset. But Henry wanted Anne. That is how I see it. But let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to his pursuit of Anne. Now, Thomas Wyatt, the famous Tudor poet, Thomas Wyatt the Elder, this is not his son, a man who appears to have been in love with Anne himself at this point, at one point. We know this because his grandson, George Wyatt, wrote a biography of Anne Boleyn and states quite clearly in it that his grandfather was in love with Anne. Now, in Wyatt's poem, the poet, Wyatt, is hunting a deer, but has to give up. He has to withdraw from the hunt when another hunter comes into play and claims the hind for himself. And the words "Caesar's I am" are written about the hind's neck. Now, Wyatt here is, the symbolism isn't very hard to uncover, is it? Wyatt is describing on how he's had to give up on Anne Boleyn because the king, Caesar, has claimed her for himself. Henry VIII is the hunter. Anne Boleyn is the powerless hind, hunted down by this hunter and then possessed entirely by him. Now, when you combine this with the king's love letters, which he bombarded Anne with, and his gifts, Anne's retreat from court, when you combine that, this has led to the idea that Anne can claim to be a sort of member of the #MeToo campaign, that Anne was a victim of sexual harassment. It's an interesting idea. Karen Lindsay, in her book, which I would recommend you read, Divorced, Beheaded, Survived, a feminist reinterpretation of the wives of Henry VIII, writes, "Today, Henry's approach to Anne would be instantly identifiable as sexual harassment. Anne, however, had no social or legal recourse against the man who ruled the country. She continued, as so many women before and since have done, to dodge her pursuer's advances while sparing his feelings. It didn't work." Now, I think the key word there in the quotation that I've taken from Lindsay's book is today. She said, today, Henry's approach to Anne would be sexual harassment. Today. Today, a business owner bombarding an employee, which is what, Anne was to Henry. She was a maid of honour to his wife. A business owner bombarding his employee with love letters and gifts after she has declined his advances and even taken time off work to get away from it all, would be accused of sexual harassment, and rightly so, obviously. But context is key here. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were 16th century people. We cannot view it or judge it with 21st century, eyes and morals. The king was expected to get what he wanted. He could just, click his fingers and get what he wanted. And Anne was pretty unusual in saying no to him. Once the king proposed to her, she submitted. She said yes. And from that point on, Anne seems to have put her everything she had, all of her effort into supporting his quest for an annulment and fighting really hard, frustratingly so at times, to be his wife and queen. So I don't believe that you can say that she is a member of the sort of, the Me Too, victims. Just can't see that. Did Anne love Henry VIII? Again, impossible to say. I think probably not at the start, but I think she did come to do so. Now, it's easy for us to forget when the iconic portraits of Henry VIII are the ones from him later in life. The ones we kind of think of Henry VIII as always being this monster, this man that executed lots of people, this brutal man. And it's easy for us to forget that Henry VIII was quite a catch at the start. At one point, when Anne knew him, he was handsome, he was charming, he was witty, he was intelligent, he was athletic, a great sportsman. He was a gifted Renaissance prince. When his father died, people were joyous that this Renaissance prince was going to become King of England. There was real hope for England because of this prince, this amazing man. Now, Anne was intelligent. She was well educated, far more educated than women normally were. And Anne and Henry shared lots of interests. They were both interested in architecture, music, theology, all sorts of things that they could talk about. What wasn't there to love about this man except that he had a wife? So I believe that Anne did fall in love with him. I don't think she was sort of berated so much, bombarded so much that she finally had to submit and think, oh, I'll just say yes because, my family are at risk. And I don't think it was that way at all. Now, I've heard it said that Henry VIII couldn't have loved Anne Boleyn because he ended up hating her and executing her. And obviously, execution isn't really a demonstration of pure love. I've heard it said that real love can't lead to a man standing by while his wife is framed for, crimes that she didn't commit and then beheaded as a result. But I can't agree with that. We all know, I'm sure, couples that have started off deeply in love, not just lust, deeply in love, but have somehow, years later, ended up absolutely hating each other and wanting to destroy each other, acrimonious divorces. But the relationship started with what can only be seen as pure love. We've all read about cases in the news where a man has murdered his wife and sometimes his children, and yet friends and neighbours are completely shocked. They all testify about how happy, this family were, how happy this couple used to be, how much in love they were. It seems that people can go from having stars in their eyes, hearts floating around their heads, being completely head over heels in love, being prepared to give their life for their partner, their loved ones, to wanting the object of their affections in the past to die a slow, painful death. We hear about crimes of passion. Love really does turn to hate. Does that mean that love never properly existed in the first place because of the fact that there is the hate there, that this person has murdered their partner? Does that mean that it was never love in the first place? No, I don't believe so. Of course not. It's just that feelings change. We're people. It's all emotions. People are human. They make mistakes. They hurt people they love. They can change and not be the same person that you fell in love with. There can be outside pressures on the relationship. All kinds of things can change a relationship and change a person. And when we realise that the love of our life is not who we thought they were, when the person that we've invested lots of time, effort and feelings into, when they let us down or they change and become someone that we don't really know anymore, then we can get really angry and hurt. And that hurt and that anger all combined can turn into just pure hatred. Sorry, Tim just made me laugh there because he's sitting behind the camera and I was sort of talking about, people hating each other, love turning to hate, and he's thinking, I can see it on his face, he's thinking, oh, she doesn't feel that way about me, does she? No, darling, you're fine. Now, when I first got married, a friend, he's putting a thumbs up now, I've got to be serious now. When I first got married, a friend quoted the Bible verse, "Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry," which is Ephesians 4:26, to me. And it was brilliant advice, and it's something that I've tried to keep to. It's very wise advice, because if you've had an argument with your other half, and you go to bed angry without sorting that argument out, without apologising and moving on from it, then if you're like me, you toss and turn. When there's something that's upset you and you're angry, you toss and you turn. That anger festers and turns into resentment, which in time can turn to hate. Your mind, very clever, the mind, your mind brings forth memories from the past when that person has hurt you before and when you've been angry with them before. And you just get angrier and angrier, and that is really bad for the relationship. Now, this may well have happened in Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's marriage. We just don't know. But Henry does seem to have been the kind of person that could just flip a switch and flip from love to hate if he felt let down by a person in any way whatsoever. An example here is Thomas More. He went from being a loved and respected father figure. I don't think I'm going too far by calling him a father figure. So he went from that to being a victim of the axeman because he refused to do what the king wanted him to do. We only have to look as well at Catherine of Aragon and Mary. Catherine of Aragon was the king's beloved wife for many years. He didn't have to marry her, when she was the widow of his brother. He didn't have to marry her. He chose to marry her, and it seems to have been a loving relationship at the start. And they had a daughter, Mary, who seems to have been, the apple of his eye at one point. So they went from being Henry's loved and pampered wife and daughter to being treated abominably by the king because they defied him. They didn't do what he wanted them to do. People who let Henry down or defied him in any way went from being favoured and loved to being hated, to being executed, to being banished from court, to being threatened, to being treated very, very badly. Now, we can't know what happened behind closed doors in Henry and Anne's marriage. We do know that it was a marriage based on love, not diplomacy. It was based on love and attraction. And that this led to Anne being worried and jealous when her husband showed an interest in another woman at court. Understandably so, because if he'd fallen in love with her and put Catherine to one side, he could potentially do it again. And we know that Henry was obsessed with having a surviving male heir. Now, did Anne's jealousy annoy the king? Did her failure to live up to his expectations and to provide him with a living son and heir make him feel let down by her? Did he begin to believe that the marriage was wrong and against God's laws, and therefore, God wasn't blessing the marriage with children, so therefore it must be wrong, like his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was wrong? Did their relationship become more storms than sunshine? Did it all become too much of a stress and effort for Henry? Did he come to believe that he'd made a huge mistake turning the country upside down and making enemies while doing so that he could marry Anne? I can't answer those questions. It's impossible to say. But it is easy to understand how those stresses could undermine Henry's love for his second wife. Now, hate is a strong feeling. Dislike is obviously not a very strong feeling, but hate is a strong feeling, just as love is a strong feeling. And I kind of think that we can only truly hate someone if we have truly loved them to begin with. They're two extremes. Of course, that's just my view. You might not agree with that. Now, historians are not in agreement about who was ultimately responsible for Anne Boleyn's fall and obviously her execution in 1536. Whether Henry VIII ordered Thomas Cromwell to remove Anne at any cost, including killing her, or whether Thomas Cromwell was behind it all and he manipulated the king and made him believe that Anne had been unfaithful. Now, if you've read my book, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown, you'll know that I'm in the Henry's to blame camp, that I see him as being ultimately responsible for him. But either way, whichever view you go with, I believe that the man, the lover who penned that distraught letter when Anne became sick in June 1528, that the man who had loved this woman enough to turn the country upside down, to risk excommunication, to make so many enemies, that man came to hate his wife. Henry came to hate Anne. His love that he once had gradually turned to hate, and that he let her be executed on the 19th of May 1536. I don't believe that her execution is evidence that Henry VIII could never have loved her. That to me doesn't make sense. But I would love to hear your views. You might agree with me entirely, you might agree with me a bit, you might completely disagree with me. Please leave comments below and let's start some discussion here. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I'm going to be answering other questions about Anne Boleyn in due course. You can subscribe to these videos and this channel by hitting subscribe below. Anyway, I'm Claire Ridgway and thank you for viewing this video. Take care. Bye bye.